Hi everyone, my name is Allie Place, and I'm the moderator of this panel entitled Human-Centered Design Education. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas, and I am a member of the steering committee of the AIGA Design Educators community. And we have an amazing panel of educators with us here today. And we'll get started by letting them introduce themselves. So let's start with you, Kareem.
Great. So yes, my name is Kareem Collie. I am, I'm one of the committee members of, steering committee members for the DEC. I am a director and clinical professor at the Claremont colleges, where I direct a center for collaborative creativity called The Hive, and teach a class in human-centered design and teach a class called Critical Design Studio, which is about visual communication design and critical engagement with culture and communication.
Marty, you want to go next?
I am Marty Maxwell Lane, Associate Professor of Graphic Design at the University of Arkansas with Allie. I teach mostly human-centered design right now. I'm also an administrator, so I'm the associate director of the school. So kind of shifting between roles through this shifting time in academia. Former DEC board member. Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. Vicki, is that you next?
Sure. I am the program director for the digital and graphic arts programs at a community college outside of Detroit, Michigan, Henry Ford College. We are probably one of the most diverse community colleges in the state, if not the country. So presenting that kind of sort of unique viewpoint from coming from a place where our students want 2 years of education and then help them grow from there.
My name is Jason Wilkins. I'm an assistant professor of practice at the School of Design and Creative Technologies at the University of Texas at Austin. Also, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on this panel with so many smart people. I teach courses in branding and typography and the senior capstone exhibition. And then also through the school, I teach graphic design summer camps to high school students.
Great. Jen, that's you next.
Jen White-Johnson, thank you for having me. I want to give a quick image description of myself for folks with disabilities who may have low vision. I am an Afro-Latina woman with cinnamon brown skin. I'm wearing big, huge loop earrings. I have a gap in my teeth, and I'm wearing like a really interesting yellow kind of headband, and I'm in my upstairs office. And I am a professor of design and visual culture at Bowie State University, which is the oldest HBCU in Maryland. So I hope to bring a pretty, interesting perspective coming from a pretty, I've been teaching at an HBCU for about 10 years, and my students are amazing. And I've also had an influx of students with disabilities come, to and fro into my office. So disability advocacy is a big part of my creative practice and what I try to bring to the campus. So a culture of acceptance when it comes to students with disabilities. I teach intro design courses, and I also teach portfolio review, both on the intro and advanced level, and then also senior thesis capstone. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jen. And Zachary? I'm
totally going to steal what Jen was talking about. So my name is Zachary Vernon. I use he, him, his pronouns. For the visually impaired, I am a generic white dude with brown hair, a little on the heavy side, but I'm working on it. I am an assistant professor at California State University, Los Angeles, where I teach in the art department in the graphic design visual communication option. My focuses are on conceptual development, branding, advertising. I also teach the senior capstone, and I teach in our MFA department, our MFA program for design.
Great. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for those wonderful introductions. So for the viewer, you can see that there are many different types of institutions represented here. So we're looking to build a perspective about the student experience that takes into consideration narratives and experiences that tend to be marginalized or othered in the design education conversation. So thank you all for being here to share those really, really important perspectives that you have of all these different institutions and these different student bodies. So I'll kick us off with just a brief discussion to introduce the panel conversation, and then I'll give the first question, let the panelists take it away. So the calamitous events of 2020 have forced design educators to shift many things, from the way we teach our classes to the role that we play in our students' lives. And they've also forced us to reckon with many problems that have existed in design education, yet have gone largely overlooked, such as inequities in the student experience, access to tools and technology, access to support, and the impact on mental health and well-being. And the aim of this panel is to explore the ways in which design education can and must shift in order to serve the student as a whole person. We are looking at this through the lens of human-centered design, which is an approach to design research that we often teach in our classrooms, and we have several experts on that here. Human-centered design meets people where they're at. It takes into consideration their pain points, their limitations, their unique needs. It fosters agency and collaboration in the process, and it employs empathy and reduced hierarchy in order to create positive outcomes for the user. So as design educators, I think it's a really important time for us to pause and consider, are we practicing what we preach? Or do we perpetuate a one-size-fits-all experience that centers the dominant narrative and marginalizes others? This question becomes particularly important in the context of remote learning. So in a meta use of the term, this conversation will explore the ways in which the principles of human-centered design can guide the ways that we approach teaching design by centering the needs of the student. And as we head into another challenging semester of uncertainty and precarious circumstances, how can we ensure that our students have safe and supported and successful learning experience? So our first question will address kind of the experience that we had in the spring semester of last year. When the pandemic first hit the United States in March of this year, nearly all colleges and universities shut down and classes went remote for the remainder of the semester. And the sudden shift shone a harsh light on the precarious circumstances many college students were already living in, and revealed the lack of support for students who are the most vulnerable: students in rural areas without reliable access to Wi-Fi, students who require learning accommodations, students with mental health issues, students who are parents, students who do not have safe housing or reliable income. So with that semester and that experience in mind, what are some of the biggest barriers to remote learning that you experienced with your students? And, but also what were some of the affordances of that learning context for your students? And anyone can take it away if you'd like to start with the answer.
I guess I can start. So tech was one of the biggest issues. A lot of students, as we said, didn't either have internet, or they didn't have the software, or they didn't have computers that were beefy enough to run the Adobe software. So that was kind of the physical manifestation of their challenges. But a lot of them, we get a lot of students like Jennifer was saying about like assisted learning students, and a lot of students with anxiety. And so the move to that environment and being away from the students, which buoy them every day together, was kind of another issue that we had to deal with. So I never said what I teach, but I teach classes from the beginning of their time to the capstone class too. So I tend to know who the students are because I'll have them 4 or 5 times through their time at the school. And I got to know most of them, and I was really surprised at how some of them, And I think Kareem had said this earlier about one of the, like some of the students who I thought were not going to make it were the ones who are the most, they came up with the most creative solutions to getting their work done. And I encouraged a lot of flexibility and a lot of using whatever tools they had to try to accomplish what they needed to do. And so I was really surprised at how there were just some really wonderful surprises. And I thought that that was really good because it gives them their own agency and what they're doing. So I thought that was an exciting thing to see. You know, because it goes beyond the tech shortcomings.
I think to piggyback off of Vicky, the tech was definitely a hurdle. Our university really worked hard to provide what we could for students who are in need. So laptops, Wi-Fi hotspots, you know, remote access to our computer labs is a thing that we're working on currently. That requires bandwidth. Like there's so many, you know, it's an interconnected web of tech. For my students specifically, one of the biggest barriers was that so many of them live in multi-generational households, and also are essential workers, or were considered essential workers. A lot of my students come from the lower end of the economic spectrum and therefore are working at the same time to support families. Several of my students had to move because of you know, locational, they were kicked out of housing because you couldn't be there because of COVID. And a lot of parents of children now having to juggle their own learning and teaching at home for their little ones. So the amounts of challenges that the students faced were about as varied as any sort of population. And so like one of the things about this conversation is that there was no one size fits all approach. Each student had to be addressed individually in terms of their own needs. And while you could maybe piecemeal a couple things together to have an overarching success, it was like kind of what we were talking about before. It was the empathy of actually listening and engaging with each individual student in a way that they were heard and their needs could be discussed. Because that was one of the biggest challenges I faced, was that a lot of students checked out and wouldn't communicate what the problem was, so that I could point them to resources, so that, you know, we could have a discussion about, well, you don't need to turn that assignment in because we're, you know, if you need an extra couple days, like that's not a problem. There was this sort of hidden curriculum that you shouldn't talk to your professor, or that they were, you know, specifically me, that I'm a hard ass, and without sort of empathy or whatever. And that was one of the, I think, the biggest hurdles to overcome, was how do you get students to express what they need individually in order to accommodate as best you can.
Thank you, Zachary and Vicky. Everything that you said pretty much nailed it. I know, kind of like taking the lead from what Zachary was saying in terms of how do we kind of get students to be, you know, honest and raw about their accessibility needs. It really started with me being vulnerable, me saying, hey, this is what I'm going through. I'm just as stressed. I'm just as disorganized. I have ADHD. So I became very like, I took ownership of my own disability, and I was willing to kind of, you know, infuse that as part of the narrative, so that the students felt like, wow, like our professor is really going through it too. Like, it's not just me. And so the minute that I chose to be very vulnerable and to let them know that I'm learning and I'm trying to figure things out right alongside them, it really made the conversation a lot more like homey. And one of my autistic students, who oftentimes is very quiet in the classroom, she like took it upon herself to create like a group me chat and like join, and I didn't even need to ask. She like went on ahead and just started like a group chat, and like really, because she's always looking for connectivity, right? You know, she's autistic, and there's like that stigma around students with disabilities that are just like, they're kind of like over in their own corner. They don't want to make friends. And going back to what Vicky was saying, you know, and then also Kareem, it was like, it gave the students the opportunity to say, wow, like I'm in this challenge. What do I need to do to stay connected? Because now more than ever, they were freaking out about not being connected. And so I really just let them lead the way in terms of how they wanted to kind of keep in touch and how they wanted to continue feeling like a unit. And we ended up becoming like this solid group of like, it was like a solid hub of just like interactivity, because I think the students, they wanted to pass the classes and they wanted to stay connected. So it really just started with me letting them know, like, I'm going through it too, y'all. Like, so we're in this together. What can we do to make this work for all of us?
You know, it was interesting for me. I actually had a slightly different experience from Jennifer. I'm going to pivot it, like flip it around, because I approached it initially from a very sort of like, all right, I got this, right? And you know, human-centered design is, as a teaching methodology, is so performative, right? It's so theatrical, and you know, so I had 2 computers set up. I had a computer here, playing my Spotify here, had my Keynote. We were using Mural. So we had Mural over here. And so I had it all set up. I'm like, this is going to be the same class that we just finished, but it's just going to be virtual. And the first week, it was just like, this is not the same class. And it happened really quickly. And so one of the things that I begin to understand is how I needed to just be very, very present, you know, and very flexible. And so by the time we got to the end of the semester, I think that, you know, the class definitely changed. It became a little lighter. You know, they were doing readings, and then they were doing, you know, because this particular class was a mixture of reading sort of like critical and cultural text while doing design work. And so I kind of had to start cutting that down, introducing other things like podcasts that were a little lighter, a little easier, and really trying to create like experiences of collaboration, and letting them sort of help one another, like, and just become more of a facilitator. I think that sort of was just this cutting away of what I perceived the class needed to be to what I wanted the class to be to what it needed to be. And so, yeah, it was a great learning experience for me that I hope to take into this next fall. Just want to add one more thing, which is that, like, you know, I started, like, even as I'm starting to create this new class for this upcoming semester, I've actually started to have a bit of anxiety. I felt like I had like an anxiety attack maybe like a week ago, and I was like, this is new, right? And so, you know, it's helpful, we're talking about empathy, to be able to recognize that we're all in this moment right now together, and to be able to take your own experience, which I oftentimes feel empathy doesn't always afford, a true understanding. But I think now there's so much overlap and intersectionality of like how we're engaging this moment right now together. There's a true opportunity for empathy in how we put together these classes.
I like that notion of just like acknowledging the situation as like creating an even starting point of just like, this is where we're at. I know that like, I know that I didn't have a single student last semester who thought that they could take advantage of the flexibility of the situation. And yet I did have, you know, students maybe disappearing or the work not being as developed as the amount of time that has passed. But it wasn't because that they didn't want to. I heard that plenty of times. They wanted to work, but it was whatever was going on in their life was now amplified. Mm-hmm. And then anything that might have made it difficult to navigate under normal circumstances, like structure, that was all now stripped away. All the culture that we built in the classroom space, whether that was the way that we conducted feedback sessions or the way that we would go tour sites where our work would live, all of that was was stripped away. And I was confident that I could rebuild it in some way, like through Slack or something, and it was a total failure. So that amplification factor is definitely something that I feel like I'll take with me into this upcoming semester in terms of being able to empathize better with the students and better understand myself, honestly.
I was thinking about when Jen, you were talking about connectivity, and then also Kareem and Jason, what you're talking about. I didn't teach in the spring, so full transparency, I was not in the trenches with you all, but I'm really involved in our program. And something that I was seeing that I'm concerned about moving forward is, you know, we have a pretty new program and we're in Arkansas. And so our program has created a community and culture where I feel like the students can really be themselves, and they have access to studios 24 hours. So their peers have become like their family, and that just is like poof, gone. And we were trying to figure out how to maintain some of that, and doing like virtual yoga classes and bingo, and like, what can we do to hold this together? And I don't know that it was successful, I'm not sure, but that's something I'm really concerned about, is how to recreate that meaningful connection and community for the students in this Zoom world. Yeah.
Actually, yeah, I'm not a panelist here, but I'm going to chime in about that too, because I mean, Marty and I we teach the same students, and that lack of community was a real problem for many of my students, and not just as a way to, you know, get their work done and be productive, but also as a really, really important social and emotional outlet in their lives. Some of them relied on that daily interaction as part of their journey of healing from trauma. And the shift to remote and being at home and alone all day was very traumatic in that regard. So this leads us kind of nicely into our next question, which we've covered a lot so far, really, is just the subject of empathy and how we employ that in the classroom. How does it inform our expectations of our students? How does it inform our relationships with them, particularly those who are the most vulnerable? But also, how does it factor into the question of objectives and assessment and rigor? And, you know, Kareem and I think Jason, you kind of touched on this. You know, how do we keep the level of work and the quality of work, you know, like where does that need to be in a remote learning context in the middle of an economic and global crisis? You know, how do we decide what rigor is appropriate in this context? And, you know, how do we be mindful of things like burnout and Zoom fatigue that we are all, you know, constantly experiencing?
This is actually, if you don't mind me stepping in here, this is actually where a lot of my current research is focused in pedagogy. And it's centered around assessment as a learning tool and not as something that you just do at the end of a project or at the end of a semester. But getting back to, and especially in the sense of human-centered design, understanding the wants and needs of our, you know, students as the people who are actually here to benefit from their education. And so one of the things that I've been doing a lot recently and discussing with our non-tenure faculty, our lecturers and adjuncts, is reframing the idea of the classroom around, you know, the learning objectives as the basis for every unit of measurement in the class, right? If we have these arbitrary understandings or rubrics of what creativity or originality means, then we're setting our students up to fail. Whereas if we focus on what they want to learn and how they approach the content, what their expectations for themselves are, and build them up from that, then it's a much more growth mindset than what I think arbitrary grading is all about. And so I've actually gotten rid of grades in my class. The only time I grade anything is at the very end of the semester because I'm required to by our university. And otherwise, beyond that, it's all feedback and discussion and self-assessment of the students assessing themselves and where they want to be, what their goals and growth is. And I found that, because one of the questions you had, Ali, was about how do we empower our students to really motivate themselves. And I do that by just reminding them that I have an education, I have a job, I have all the things that I wanted in my career. So I don't need their portfolio. I don't need their work in my work, right? I have found my self-worth and I have found what I love to do. And so I challenge them to find the same. How do you approach the content of this course? Because this is what we've decided is important for you to know from an industry perspective, and from a foundational perspective of what design is and the knowledge systems that we use. But what are you going to do with it? Because I don't really care if you make a package design or a book design or a website or a full experience or what have you. What I care about is, are you understanding the concepts of what I'm teaching you, and are you applying those in a direction that you want to go? And that sort of empowers them to take risks and create their own standards of rigor that are not coming from me as some arbitrator of what good design is. Right? Because, I'm one person and I have an opinion, but that's it.
I think, just regarding the idea of kind of like building like a culture of suffering where you have to, work, pull multiple all-nighters in order to meet deadlines. And now, because of the fact that we're online, that's now impossible. Well, I think that just meant that it was never really kind of like good in the first place. And so I know that whether I give 2 weeks on a project or 5 weeks on a project, I'm really going to get like 3 to 5 days of solid work to meet that specific deadline. And that's true for students. That's true for whenever I was working in a design studio. And so it's not a student's problem, in my opinion, with time management, say, because of the, being online or something like that. I see it as my problem in terms of how I manage the activities, the daily activities of my class. And I think I'm finding that whenever I give assignments, I'm kind of compacting both the creation of ideas as well as the craft of them into a single deadline. And those are really, in my opinion, two different kinds of skill sets. When is it that we need to communicate ideas and intent? And when is it that we need to focus and refine? And so something that I've been wondering about is, should I be creating different kinds of milestones that sort of don't culminate to a single point, and treat the classroom as more like a workshop? Regarding the kind of the language of who's the most vulnerable, I think for myself, I'm trying to unpack that term. There are kind of structural ways for me to understand it in terms of unequal access to resources that as we've been talking about. And that should definitely inform our expectations and relationships with our students. My sense, as we've also sort of touched on, is that each student has their own vulnerabilities. And if I generalize what vulnerable means, then I might be overlooking some of the distinct needs of our students. I also want to be conscious not to develop a paternalistic relationship because of those vulnerabilities, because I can think of many instances where what a student might identify as their biggest vulnerabilities has been sort of their unique design lens, their superpower, if you will. And so that this idea of like vulnerability is just something that I'm trying to unpack and figure out how it shapes my relationships with the students.
this idea earlier mentioned of like rigor, and this question of like rigor and agency. I think one of the things that I'm taking on is like how, as the facilitator of the class, how can I be more rigorous with my creation of like experiences for the students, and really taking on like this challenge, right? So like I'll be teaching this semester, I'll be teaching the human-centered design class. And one of the things that the human-centered design class, the way we teach it, is that we try to express or have joy expressed through the class and through the different exercises that we do. The center, like I said, is the center of collaborative creativity, right? And so it's all about creative confidence. Let me just say, I may be different from most of you in that I actually don't teach designers or design students. I teach liberal arts students. So the Claremont colleges is like a highly selective consortium of 5 colleges, and design is not even like a major. And so we're actually introducing design into the space. So most of my students are liberal arts students who have an interest in design, or have an interest in, what is this human-centered design thing? Or like, I heard this class is like really interesting and, you know, unique. So we approach it from the lens of an introduction into the human-centered design practice. And so theatricality is a big part of it. You know, throughout the semester, we'll bring in like a improv coach, or we'll bring in, someone who practices clowning, right? And so I've been thinking, like, how can I amplify those experiences this semester coming up? How do I get them out and away from their computers? Because so much learning can happen in the experiences. Human-centered design is about making connections, right? And about being out in the world and empathizing and sharing experiences. And so creating those opportunities for the students in rich ways, I think will, something I'm really pressed to try to accomplish, while also condensing, because we're actually condensing our semester. I think we're pulling, 2 to 3 weeks, chopping it off the back end of it. And so the curriculum that we usually have for this class also needs to be compressed. So so I'm really thinking about, okay, in compression, like, you know, what are some of the things that I can do? And, you know, there was a question about how do we give the students more agency? And I'm like, wow, you know, that's a really good question. Like maybe during labs, like we come up with some sort of community guidelines, and maybe I open it up to them to like, what do you want to do in your lab to start the class? Like, we don't have to start the class with like a lecture. Do we want to start the class with a meditation session or yoga, or, you know, or jumping jacks? I don't know. I think I'm going to open up some opportunities for that sort of creativity, right? Because it is still them helping me, right? Or helping us design this class, right? Which is what they're here to do, human-centered design. So maybe introducing a little bit more of the design process of the experience that they're even having into you know, their hands.
One thing I'm thinking about, and I feel like I have more questions than answers today, but particularly with empathy, I'm thinking about attendance policies. And our program, at least, and the programs I've all been through, have all had very strict attendance policies. And I'm thinking this is something that maybe just should have always been relooked, and now this is an opportunity to do that. But I mean, I don't feel comfortable sticking to our attendance policy with the enhanced anxieties, the lack of mental health care, just the general state of our health care. So I'm starting to think more about shifting attendance to somehow to participation, but also then thinking about introverts and extroverts and how I assess participation and what that looks like. But that's something that I hope we can come out on the other side of this with more empathetic approaches to attendance, if we can figure out the right way.
No, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Marty, because a lot of it has to do with asynchronous versus synchronous teaching, and are we expected to like meet with them at 10 a.m. to like 1:50 like every Monday, Wednesday, and we pretty much had to really, you know, reframe that completely, and the students were comfortable with that, and it's like, okay, right, like, does it start, will Monday just be dedicated to a discussion and reflection, and then you have the week to be able to kind of like ruminate and like come up with like a really cool like system and design that we submit like online so that we can all engage with, and that's really how it flowed this past semester. So the students were really comfortable like uploading work, like whether it was to like Flickr or, you know, Blackboard was like a beast and we all hated it. So so Flickr was like really fun. And I think that students were excited about being able to kind of share, and they were looking forward to that. So participation was like key for us, you know, and to me that really measured like the level of, are they even engaged? Do they even want to post? Do they want to share their work? Do they feel, and then I would also let them know, look, I'm also going to be sharing your work, like, you know, on social media, if you're cool with that, so that the community knows that we're still like working, we're still like creating, we're still, you know, coming up with some really interesting, like, you know, pieces for dialogue, especially from, you know, the Black perspective. Like, it was really important that we showed the nation, the country, that like these Black students have like ideas and that they're going to come through, and that as difficult as access with COVID was, they were like, man, like, I'm trying to get my degree. Like, I'm really trying to come out of this successful, you know? And they were, you know, really open to it. And then the school in general was looking for stuff to continue to highlight. So when it came time to do like COVID zines, you know, at first they were like, oh, like, we're stressed out, we don't want to talk about COVID. I'm like, well, what else are y'all gonna talk about? I mean, this is really like hitting us like to our cores right now, you know, like it's totally cool to be able to, and I was like, I'm gonna be making a COVID zine right along with you. Like, y'all give me some tips on how I can like navigate through this system. Like, I want to know how y'all are feeling, how y'all are doing. And then we got like a really cool highlight from the school, and that never happens during the semester. I would have had to like beat university marketing down to say, can you please feature like our cool COVID zines? Like, but it really took this situation for the school to be like, man, like, we have these departments that have always been encouraging their students to take the agency, encouraging their students to like kind of go above and beyond and seek within themselves about topics that they want to explore that are like really vulnerable. And then bam, like a cool feature on the website. It got the students an opportunity to feel like, oh, I'm being seen. My work is still being amplified. I'm being amplified as a student through this pandemic. So it's just keeping those communication lines open to let the campus community as a whole know, like, we're not going to stop doing what we're doing, and you need to amplify. Like, if students still feel like they're being heard and they're given space from the campus in general, not just from the department, then they'll feel like my school, like my unit, like my community, they really care about me. So I'm going to feel like I'm safe throughout this weird time. So
I just want to kind of chime in on both Marty and what Jen was talking about regarding like attendance policies and if those should have just been re-examined regardless. I know we've had discussions in our department with, you know, the more money you have, the closer you can live to campus, or you can afford to like jump on one of those scooters and like, you know, walk a lot faster than you might ordinarily would be able to. And so, you know, I think that those are, or that you can afford to get your car fixed, or, you know, whatever it might be. So I think that all seems totally like in the right direction to head. I'll say that regarding kind of synchronous, asynchronous, I erred too much last semester on the side of asynchronous, thinking that like, yeah, there are going to be all of these sort of inequities in terms of internet access and so on and so forth, that I'm going to try to reduce the amount of synchronous activity and we'll do more asynchronous stuff. And the great part is that like you don't have to meet with me now between 11 to 2 because I've got all day in some ways. So just book a time with me on Calendly. And now, rather than spending 5 minutes with you in class, which would maybe be a lot of time, now I can spend 15 minutes with you. So I thought that was going to be really great. But in some ways, it deteriorated a sense of structure. And so again, I'm still like thinking through this synchronous, asynchronous, how much, so on and so forth.
So if I could jump in, our attendance has always sort of been tied to the participation. But one of the things that I want, so we're doing this live without the drive. So one day we'll be live and we'll have like the lecture and a discussion. And the other day I'm going to do open meetings by appointment, I guess, or I'll be on chat or something. But one of the things that I don't want to just create busy work for them. So it's that struggle of how do we set up the projects. And I found for us that like long-term projects, they just died somewhere in the middle and they couldn't see the end of it. So that was not great during the winter term. But we also, being in Detroit, a lot of my students were hit really early on with COVID in their families, or because they were now online, they were asked to work 60 hours at the local grocery store instead of 30. So because they were young. So it is a struggle to figure it out. And I always like to think, and I think somebody else said it too, is I don't approach going into this as that people are going to cheat or people are going to shortchange everything. And I'd like to sort of approach it with, we're all doing the best that we can and everybody's here to learn. And I think I'm just going to try to remain flexible with them. But there's more of a, this is not triage, this is going to be fall online. So I think we have to be for ourselves. And I know my program is, I'm the only full-time person. Everybody else is an adjunct faculty and they're working so much harder than ever before. And I just keep saying that you guys don't make it too hard on yourselves and don't add unnecessary things to your students just so that you have some benchmark to say that they checked in. So make it meaningful and make it part of the overall progress. And I just think that flexibility is still going to be needed this term and probably even in the winter term if things don't start getting better. But yeah, I think we just have to be flexible and listen to everybody's stories and try to find it. And you know, I know this isn't the question, but I really honestly, like, people have said to me, because our design program is doing pretty well overall for the whole college. And I've said to people that, you know, honestly, this is good practice for future designers because we are using a variety of technology and tools and we are, you know, hired on project basis and not a 9 to 5. So there's a lot of remote work that people are doing now. So I think it's all really good experience for where they're going to go. So I try to act like this is all normal and we're up and we're good, but yeah, vulnerable too.
There's really quickly, like, there's a thing that Vicky and Jason said that I feel is really important for educators to understand. It's probably been part of our alternative teaching training at Cal State LA, and that is that we can't, like, because we are all online, because we're on Zoom, because, you know, our accessibility has, quote unquote, gone up, that doesn't mean that we should be accessible at all times, because we are also people who have vulnerabilities and needs and whatnot, and our mental health is important. And there's this idea that, I know I fell into this trap last semester because I wanted to be there for my students and help them in whatever way I could. So it's like, email me, we'll set up a time, I'll, you know, whatever, 9 to 6, and, you know, I'm available via Zoom, because what else am I doing, right? Except I was doing everything, right? I was restructuring the class. I was having meetings with, you know, faculty. And there's this idea that we need to have a low bandwidth for ourselves, as well as our students, right? We can't expect them to be available all times, so we shouldn't expect that of ourselves. And if we start, you know, degrading our structures that we have in place and stop taking care of ourselves, we're not going to be helpful to our students and at our, you know, doing our A game. So to Jason and Vicky's point, like, we're working really, really hard, and we need to make sure that we don't overtax ourselves to the point where we're useless. So
I liked how Vicky said, this isn't triage, this is the fall semester online. And I think that's so good, because it just makes me think of, if you're familiar with I don't know, an online platform called Issue, where it's like a book, but like online and it looks like a book. Like, that seems so pointless to me whenever the web can like offer so many opportunities. And that seems like a similar sort of framing with, the moment that we're in is, yeah, it's challenging, but it's also a moment to really embrace the medium and reinvent the way that we approach our courses and how we structure them, so that it isn't some weird version translated onto Zoom.
So that leads us really nice into our next topic, where I want to make sure we cover really well. And actually, before I say that, thank you for bringing up the topic of mental health on the educators part. I'm going to put in a quick plug. There's a panel on Thursday, the week of the conference, about mental health and design education for the educators. And that's led by Kalina Sales, who is also on the DEC steering committee. So highly recommend that panel. And it's a pre-recorded panel, so you can watch it asynchronously. So we've kind of touched on this in a lot of ways, but I really want to address it head on, this topic of access and accessibility. And in a remote learning context, especially, how are we accommodating the varying needs of our students? This also relates to mental health on the students' part. And especially whether we call it triage or not, I mean, this is still kind of an on-the-fly moment. We're not all experts in remote education. Maybe we're trying to become experts in it, and it's a lot of work to do that. So how do we make sure that we're keeping accessibility at the front of our minds? We're keeping the varying needs of our students at the front of our minds through this on-the-fly moment, and those most vulnerable students. And expanded definition of that term, which thank you, Jason, for talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, it all really depends on what their accessibility needs were before, we transitioned to remote learning. I try to stay abreast of what my students need from the very beginning. Hopefully if they have all their documentation in place. So that way, we can just kind of keep going, and I can kind of shift some things around. But then some students who weren't necessarily had a documented disability, really had to be really honest with me to say, hey, professor, I feel like I'm gonna fail, online learning isn't for me. And they were ready to give up. So the question is, okay, so what can we do to kind of assist you moving forward, but also not for you to feel like you have to mask, or you have to, compartmentalize, or you have to be this perfect little entity. How can you still be yourself but still be really successful? So it's just really about pointing them to various resources. Naturally, if a student has ADHD, I'll be able to have that discussion because I have that lived experience. But if I don't have that lived experience, I want to be able to make sure that I point them in the right direction so that they can get the resources that they need, whether it's through disability support services, if they're doing a great job, because that's neither here or there on certain campuses, pointing them in the right direction so that they can at least be a part of a community where they can feel supported from a disability perspective. That's number one, because I'm not going to sit up here and try to guide my student in terms of accessibility needs that they need if I don't understand what those accessibility needs are. But then also making sure that they feel comfortable having that discussion. They need to feel completely comfortable, so that they don't have to mask. That's step number one. And then just being able to help them navigate. So just listening and observing. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell them, well, this is what you need to do if you have anxiety, if you have all of these things, because we need to figure it out, because you have to you have to pass these courses, even if that means that I have to have a discussion with their parents or with, their, most of the students, I'm their advisor. So I'm able to kind of help them navigate. but you know, I try to be able to have try to be able to create some form of team where everyone is in the know. Because because it can't just be a discussion between myself and the student. Like, everybody needs to be able to understand how the student works, period.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think that one of the things that I found that we found last semester was that we do a lot of group work, right? A lot of projects where students are collaborating. And so, you know, just anecdotally, we would, you know, jump into like a Zoom breakout room and conversations will be being had, right? So students are sort of working out some of these issues or just, I found a lot of instances of students just maybe smiling or laughing or talking more casually in those spaces. And I thought that was a helpful thing. Just making sure that, you know, some of the support was coming from their colleagues, right? And one of the things that we did at the beginning of the semester, I'm sorry, not at the beginning of the semester, but when right after the spring break, was we sent out a form to the students, an accessibility form, just to sort of like, one, acknowledge that we're listening and we want to make sure that we're taking into account your concerns right now, and you know, trying to bring those concerns to the foreground of the conversation that we're going to have as the semester begins, or as the semester continued. And another thing that as we're talking, I'm wondering about in terms of accessibility. I wonder, because so many students are like going to take off this semester or take off this next year. And so the students coming back, I'm wondering, you know, how are they coming back, and what are the expectations coming back? This is just a question that I have that as we're talking, I'm wondering about, like, if you're back, is it a desire to be back? Is it because you have to be back? Or do you feel prepared to be back? I don't know. It's just something I'm wondering about. I wonder if any of you begin to engage that.
Yeah, that is a huge, a lot of my students are very pressured by their families. They're the first of their generation, or the first generation students. You know, we have one of the highest numbers of DACA recipients at our school. We have, you know, an incredibly diverse first gen group that the pressures and expectations of their families, the needs of them to get the degree, to get the job, to pay for living expenses, to take care of loved ones. A lot of our students, one of the conversations I have with a lot of students is, you know, why are you here? What's your purpose? What are you getting a degree for? Because if you want skills, you can go, you know, LinkedIn Learning, you can go YouTube, like whatever, you can get skills. But what are you coming to the university for? What is the purpose for this degree? And so many of them are just like, well, I need to get a job in order to, you know, move away from my parents' home for the first time. I want to live my own life, etc. And a lot of them are also taking care of grandparents or taking care of kids. And so I think the motivations kind of range all over the place. And that is, I think, sort of an issue in regards to the students' well-being and mental health is the pressure of performance within the class in order to, like, I mean, Jen talked about, you got to pass these classes to move on to the next, you know, class or to whatever the program is requiring of you. And so that weight just sits on them because on top of cultural, on top of familial, on top of all these other expectations that they put on themselves. And I think that especially, like Marty was talking earlier about, like, the state of our mental health, you know, systems, the healthcare system in general, we're not really doing a lot, right? Like, we can't offer as much as we would love to, and none of us are trained healthcare workers or mental health experts. And so while I love to be an advocate and help them and point to resources, and, we have a thing on campus where I can walk a student over to counseling services to help them set up an appointment. Can't do that anymore. So like, what do you really provide? And so in terms of accessibility, in regards to some of these abstract issues that aren't like, Office of Disability Services or whatever can help with getting tutors, getting, materials and things that are required for different types of learning. But when you're talking about mental health, when you're talking about these other sort of expectations, it comes from colleagues, it comes from, mental health professionals. And so one of the things that I do in my syllabus now and in every class in our online learning management system is provide every single resource that I can think of for the students in regards to what our university provides, right? How you can get mental health, advice, how you can set up a counseling, how you can set up a healthcare visit, how you can get a COVID test, because our university does free COVID testing. All of those things go into a page on our website or on my course website, every single course that says, here's what we've got. And if anybody is ever having an issue, I just point them right directly to that resource, because that's, the first and only kind of major step that I can do to provide a range of those answers, right? We talked about there's no one size fits all solution. So instead it's a gumbo. You just put everything in there and hope that something works for somebody, right?
I hadn't even thought about, we do this too, where we walk students over to the counseling center, and it works. It's so much more effective than here's the link or here's the email. And I hadn't even thought about not being able to do that. So I'm just thinking about myself, and I think, and I do this already, but just like Jen has been talking about a lot, just being really open for your students. And I always laugh at just this idea of faculty as expert. It's like, I'm not an expert in all the things. Just being vulnerable about that at the beginning, I think we probably need to lean into that pretty hard this semester and make sure that I'm creating like a really open space where students trust me so that I can help them to do the virtual walk over to CAPS or whatever that looks like. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I haven't even thought of that.
Thank you, Zachary and Marty, because it's such an important conversation. And that's why like I've been teaming up with like just other schools like within my area to see, well, how can we collectively, because this is like a collective liberating opportunity where we can decide like, okay, so am I going to stay in my silo at my HBCU, or am I going to be able to like mandate that like multiple schools in my area that we rally together? So we have like a virtual town hall that we're planning right now, like ourselves, University of Maryland, maybe Towson University, a couple of other schools, to have like students with disabilities like kind of call out and say, hey, like these are some of the accessibility needs that I'm demanding, that I want to ensure that I have when the fall semester begins. And I feel like having their voices included in what they want for that conversation to be is going to be super critical, because then that gives other students the opportunity to say, hey, like, man, I'm going through the same thing. Oh my God, I had no idea. And then being able to kind of see like other student voices that are willing and comfortable being able to kind of have that discussion to like put their full selves out there. And yeah, like Zachary was saying, like a toolkit that is like infused in like the syllabi, saying, hey, like, first of all, like the classroom is a safe space, like what Kareem was talking about earlier, like establishing that from the beginning and letting know that these are the different voices that are sitting within our virtual classroom. And this is a place where the utmost respect is required for folks that are different from you, that learn differently. And if you're not here to accept those folks, then this is not a space that So I think like letting, again, like we've been talking so much about agency, so it's like this is going to be a really cool chance for the students to feel heard. And those students who have been asking for these types of accommodations for so long anyway, you know, and now like this is like the opportunity where those students are like, wow, like all of these things I've been asking for, or that I felt like I wasn't being given at my university, or that I never knew about. Now everyone's like making a point to make sure that like everybody knows, and everyone's willing to make those accommodations for me now. So.
Yeah, I think just like centering on accessibility will only benefit all of the students. And so, yeah, just like we were talking about, just because the resources exist doesn't mean that the students are going to go to them on their own. So just thinking about this idea of agency, it seems that our responsibility is to empower the students to have that kind of agency. And one of the ways to do that is to create spaces of trust. And the way that we can create spaces of trust are by making sure that they are accessible, as like a signal to say, hey, I see you, I hear you, you can come talk to me and I can help you there. So yeah, definitely not thinking of the students, not putting the responsibility of this on the students to speak up and say, I need this or that, but to empower them to have the agency and to have the trust to want to communicate what their needs are.
I mean, we think about like the tenets of universal design, and one of the things we've noticed over the last several decades that we've been implementing more of the human-centered, the accessible options, is that designing for the most extreme cases benefits the entire populace. And I think that when we approach the way we do universal design in our fields to the way that we design our courses, it's the same thing, right? Like, what are we providing the students, and how is it, we talked about affordances and the ways that we change up how we present information and provide information, right? Like, I've got a lot of, very easy to read, very accessible articles now in my classes instead of lectures, because it's a text only format. There's a lot of you can have voice to text. I make sure that the videos, if I do videos, are all closed captioned and not auto generated. Like all the things that we take for granted as privileged, able-bodied, whatever people. When we design our courses to say, okay, well, instead of submitting a PDF, right, because maybe you don't have access to a computer, can you take a couple screenshots on your phone, or whatever, take some pictures with your phone? And I love like uploading to Flickr, right? But what is a free application service that we can use? What are these alternatives to Turn-In, right? What are these alternatives to making and creation that we can provide access to? And we have to understand, and I think the industry really needs to start embracing this deviation from industry's standard, software to just the act of making and the outcomes, right? What should we be really pushing and teaching in our classes? I personally hate software classes. I think they're pointless in a university education when I can just, go to LinkedIn Learning or YouTube or layers.com or whatever and get all that information. But the act of critical making, of using software and using tools and using whatever we have around us to do things, I can take a picture on my phone that's better than cameras, 15 years ago. And I don't see why we shouldn't allow the students to utilize what they have around them, what they have access to, rather than pushing specific software or making requirements on them. My students can't afford to get a laptop. Students can afford to have all these different devices and softwares, even with the reduced prices of Creative Cloud that we get at the university. I mean, if it's not free, then they're, fighting that over food, rent, childcare, etc. So I think we have to really be thoughtful in what we require of our students and how they access the materials and the outcomes of our class.
Thank you, Zachary. I'm going to jump in. I wouldn't be a good moderator if I wasn't being mindful of the time. So I want to shift us into just giving some concluding thoughts. We've touched on so many important topics, and I think we could unpack them for a really long time. But can we start to summarize or maybe speculate where we're going from here? How does this current time inform where we're going? So many things are changing. What's going to continue to change? What are some things that are never going to be the same? What do you see as the future of design education as being informed by this time?
I would like to just throw in where I'm coming from. So we do have some software classes. Well, we have one that's just basically a software class. And a lot of students come to our school because it's a community college, so everybody comes. There's no testing to get in. We have English as a second language. We have assisted learning students, and we're extremely diverse. But a lot of students don't know how to learn. So they don't know how to learn. So yeah, we can go and do Skillshare, and we can go find whatever. But to be truly accessible and truly inclusive, we have to kind of keep in mind that not every student can go to four-year college. And I know that 4 years of education is better. 6 might even be better yet with how much we need to know these days. But what I like to encourage students to maybe DACA as well, like get your 2 years, try to get some work going. And obviously it's going to be entry level, but that confidence of getting the first step done often will lead to a tangential degree when they're ready to go back, or maybe it gives them the confidence and then they work a little bit and save money and then go on to 4 years. So, but what's also scary is that design colleges are closing right now. So I think we lost 3 of them this year. So it's kind of something to think about.
I think, Allie, back to your very huge question about what is the future of design education? I don't know, but I'm thinking about one thing. I feel, and I think those of us in this call, it seems like have been doing this. It seems like we are naturally talking about empathy in the classroom and those things. But, I think it's going to be hopefully and across the board more of a reckoning of students as whole beings and not just someone that drops into your class for a few hours or a semester and then goes on. I hope it will be a more natural acknowledgement of all the different things that they come with and they're facing and that they offer.
I would like to, I think one of the things that I hope will, what I imagine will come from this is a diversity of access points. And so, having online learning now, which has been this big question, is it working, can it work, for the last decade, being pushed into that space.
Looks like we lost Kareem. Well, would someone like to start answering while we wait for him to come back?
Sure. Yeah, so in response to that large question, some of the things that I think about is just that there are other, maybe Kareem.
All right, I'm having connection issues. I just finished that.
Yeah.
It's going to change the future, right? That's it.
Thanks, Kareem.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there are forces beyond COVID right now that are shaping the way that we're thinking about the future of design education. And I think that one of the things that has to change is that kind of like just like in music, that the space in between the notes is just as important as the notes themselves. The things that we don't acknowledge in our teaching is going to be just as important as the things that we are teaching. And so we have to broaden our scope in terms of what we're presenting to our students. We can't inoculate ourselves from that fact kind of any longer. And I think what that's kind of suggests is that we do have to re-examine the student to professor kind of hierarchy. And, you know, because again, we're all learning how much we don't know, or maybe even a better way to say it is we're all learning how much other people already knew. And so, but we can't know everything, and we have to kind of humbly accept that. And so that means that we have to try to figure out a way for our students to be empowered to fill those voids. And maybe that suggests that they're learning from each other. Maybe that suggests that they're learning from themselves more year over year, because the assignments that they're responding to capitalize on their different experiences, their different knowledges, the different skills that they have. So yeah, I think just broadly, the thing that will shift is that we have to be rethink how we are more inclusive about the things that we're teaching, and be conscious of the things that we're not. And in that way, that reshapes the hierarchy between student to professor.
Yep, everything that Jason just said. And my biggest thing too is access, right? We've been talking about access, but I mean, corporations now are like, we've gotten so many responses from Nickelodeon and Pixar and like all these spaces that are like, oh, like, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, like these students, they actually exist and they've been creating work all this time. And they're like, because they're, you know, the most marginalized community, and they have, you know, an equitable access to resources, it's challenging corporations to like shift and to rethink how they're making their just their like companies more accessible to students who felt like they didn't have access before. So I hope that the future is making sure that those corporations are finally starting to see and to notice and to actually give more opportunities, but more like realistic opportunities, like not just saying, oh, we're having like a hiring or we're looking for interns, but it's like, what are things that they can provide more of so that our students can like really navigate into like their spaces on like very equitable terms. So if that means that, you know, certain huge corporations can do more workshops and do more virtual like chats and town halls and things like that with students, it's like making sure that if they want to be able to like show that they're in solidarity with BIPOC students and students that are the, you know, at the most need, well then what are they going to do now? What are they going to do to make sure that our students feel like, oh, we can be successful and we can actually, you know, make it in this industry? So that's what I'm hoping to see, is more opportunities and more of those huge corporations that are creating the softwares, that are creating these big time jobs, realizing that we need to be able to change the surface. We need to be able to change the face of like who's even being employed and who's even working there.
Yeah, just to piggyback, I think Jason said such a beautiful statement about recognizing that what we know isn't the only knowledge system that exists, right? That other people know things that we should, you know, appreciate. I think it's such an incredible direction for the world right now, because we get siloed into our, you know, our media silos and our echo chambers and in our own cultures and whatnot. And I think the effect that that's having or will have on design education is an acknowledgement that there is no divesting from culture. There is no divesting from the state of the world and the effects that design has on it, and vice versa. And I think that recognizing, acknowledging, accepting, and teaching that our students have agency, right? Jason said a really, you know, Jason, you've been really on point today. a great thing about how some of our students, perceived vulnerabilities are their greatest strengths or what made their superpower. And I think design education, moving away from the master model of like Bauhaus and whatnot, and going towards more of a growth and empowerment of the student's own natural abilities and interests and skills, and growing those while also providing a range of other tools and other methods of thinking. And, college to me was always an introduction to different modes of thought, right? Different perspectives, and critical analysis of my own place and my perspective on the world. I think that's one of the things that design is so good at, is that we're observers. We observe human conditions, we observe systems, and then we break them apart and we make them better, or at least try to, right? And I think that's where design is going. We're breaking apart our own education system. We're breaking apart our own pedagogy and what we think is right to teach, with finally the voices of marginalized people and those whose knowledge and skills have been lost or denigrated or devalued for so long. And, finally sort of acknowledging and lifting those up and saying, no, traditional ways of making or other forms of thought, other approaches are incredibly valid and need to be a part of this conversation in order to do better. And I think that's where design education is leading, is away from the master model and more of the student has a perspective, the student has knowledge, the student has skills, and we're here to help them grow that individually as a whole being, as Marty said.
And Zachary, amazing, because that master model, we know, like, it doesn't exist anymore. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. It doesn't. Oh, this is 2020, and just from like the Black perspective and like the BIPOC perspective, like that model doesn't really fit. They don't fit that model because they're their own model. Their culture continues to be appropriated anyways because they're creating the model, period. So what you said, like, it's our job to basically, right, like, continue to like dismantle and to break these systemic changes and to let this, like, let the students that their culture is being appropriated, let them continue to build that. And like you said, like, there's value in that. And if our job is to completely shift them and to say, hey, like, well, what you're creating really doesn't really fit the overall aesthetic, and it's not necessarily what the design industry is looking for. Like, what are we saying to that student? Like, I'm done with that. I'm done with that conversation, because like, we've been talking about amplification, uplifting the Black student, and I'm not gonna try to act like their aesthetic is not valuable if that is what culture is consistently trying to appropriate, period.
I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for that. So this conversation will be posted on Tuesday of the week of the summit. And we would really love, I mean, obviously there are so many things that we didn't get to address here, we could really dive into further. So we'd love to continue this conversation with everyone in the Slack channel on Tuesday. There'll be a Slack channel for that day. It's the teaching themed day. And we'd love to answer questions or welcome, more input on this conversation so we can continue to address these really, really, really important issues. But I want to thank you all so much for being here. Your perspectives are just incredible. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I think this is similar to the idea of being a professor, and that you think like you're just going to be relaying whatever it is that you know, but I felt like I learned so much.
And taking notes and everything.
Yeah. A lot of notes taken today. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you for organizing this, Allie.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Seriously.
All right. We'll see you all on the Slack channel.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.